Channel for our weekly Q&A, where we talk all things history every Saturday and Sunday afternoon, 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturdays, 4 p.m. Eastern on Sundays, 9 o'clock in Great Britain, 1 o'clock on the Pacific Coast, all of that great stuff. So I will be bringing you some history facts, some information, some topics that I like to discuss in the next hour, and hopefully you guys have some questions, comments, historical topics you would like to bring up. If you appreciate history and you like learning more about history and you enjoy the channel and you enjoy what I'm talking about and you want to hear more of it, be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. We are currently closing in on 4,700 subscribers. It has been an amazing ride. We've only been doing this just over 7 months, and the support, the feedback, the comments, the likes, the subscriptions, it's all been really wonderful. And we've got some fans that have been around since basically the beginning of the channel, and it's really helped the channel grow. So if you could do that, if you appreciate what you're hearing, if you like what I'm talking about, then be sure to do that, and it would be really great to have you along for the ride. Again, the goal is 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we do this every Saturday and Sunday, so please join us. This is my way to give back. You guys get to bring up, you guys see the videos that I produce, the topics I produce, the shorts I make, and maybe some of the fuller length videos. I just finished up a series on the Roman emperors, and now I'm moving into powerful female rulers, and I've got a few videos about that. I do daily history videos, biographies, and who passed away on this day, as well as historical myths, memes, and all sorts of other great stuff. So really appreciate all of the support for the channel and the support that you guys have brought. And this is my way to give back to you by listening to you guys bring up anything you want to talk about history-wise, history topics, questions, comments, things. People have brought up stuff on this channel that I didn't even know about and I learned about. A great example was Unit 731, the Japanese human experiments that they did on Chinese POWs during World War II, which a lot of people don't know about. So that was something that was big for the channel, and I learned about it because somebody was nice enough to bring it up here. Hello, welcome, thank you for coming, and I appreciate whoever just liked the video. Liking the feed really helps grow the channel, helps draw attention, gets eyes on the channel. Be sure to like and subscribe because it's really going to help the channel grow. We're here to talk about anything that you want to talk about, social science related, history, government, different types of history throughout all the world, social studies related things, geography. Of course, we do talk about politics from time to time, but as an objective as way possible. The Trail of Tears, that's a great topic to start off with. I've got a few of my own topics that I'm going to get to, but somebody brought up the Trail of Tears, and that's a really, really great one. So the Trail of Tears was a forced movement of Native Americans out of their lands in the southeastern part of the United States in the 1830s and 40s, performed by the United States government. Originally, there had been a treaty made between the Native Americans and the U.S. government to be able to settle in lands in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. And 5 different tribes were affected: the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee. And the Cherokee tribe was the most aggressively against this. Some other groups, like the Creek, made deals with the U.S. government to be able to stay on their land temporarily, and they were all being pushed out of the southeastern part of the United States and sent to Indian Territory, as it was called, which is now modern Oklahoma. And that is why, by the way, Oklahoma has the largest amount of Native Americans and the largest amount of reservations for Native Americans in the United States to this day. Although Arizona and New Mexico, very close, the Southwest has the largest numbers of Native Americans. So the Trail of Tears was the difficult, harsh, and often cruel path that the natives had to take. One of the groups that protested, obviously, this result was the Cherokee, and they did it through the litigatory process. They didn't go to war, they didn't fight, but they went through the legal system, and they used the United States judicial system against the United States government, who had passed Indian removal under President Andrew Jackson. So eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the most important Chief Justices in American history, ruled in favor of the Cherokee and said they don't have to move. President Jackson ignored the ruling and basically said, well, he's made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And as the executive under him, and then the next president, Martin Van Buren, the natives were pushed out of Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and forced along this difficult, bitter place where the trail where they were suffering from diseases, harsh weather. They definitely had a deadline, so they were rushing, and about 25% of them died en route to Oklahoma. It's one of the most horrible experiences in American history, one of the saddest chapters, and it definitely did not have to happen if Jackson hadn't been so stubborn and bullheaded. So a lot of people in the United States really like Andrew Jackson, and there's really not a lot of great reasons to like Andrew Jackson. How many moved? I don't know. I I don't know how many, it would depend on the number of Cherokee at the time, but it was basically total relocation of them from one part of the United States to another, displacing them, taking away land that they had lived on for generations because that land needed to be used for new settlements for whites. So it is a sad and racist chapter in American history, and it stands as a cruel reminder of what happens when people are displaced and dispossessed of their land, and how often the arduous and difficult journeys are for them, and they oftentimes end up in really bad straits. So fortunately, my trusted moderator has put in the social media handle. So if you like what you just heard about the Trail of Tears and you want to learn more about history, and you enjoy talking about history, and you enjoy social studies, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. But follow me on all of those handles. I'm on X, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Facebook. It would be nice to have you along for your support. Thank you to whoever just liked. It really helps the channel grow. And so that's a little bit about the Trail of Tears. But if you have anything you would like to talk about, social science related, history related, I'm going to be here for the next hour talking about it. Drop it in the chat, and I'll be happy to go over it with you guys. Of course, I got a few topics of my own that I want to get to, but I'm happy to be here and take your questions, comments, concerns, anything you want to know social science related. Thank you for that. Thank you for that religious reminder. I definitely needed that in the middle of a history stream. But yeah, and so you've got the social media handles, you got the ability to like and subscribe, really helping the channel grow. My goal is 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and you guys can make it happen. That's why I really appreciate you guys. That's why I do these live streams. It's giving back. It's you guys get to bring up anything you want to talk about, because my videos are always more or less what I want to talk about. So anyways, I've got a few topics of my own that I wanted to bring up at some point, but if anyone has any questions, comments, history topics they'd like to bring up, drop them in the chat and I will get to them in a timely order. So obviously, a lot of people wonder, what is the most impactful and interesting decade maybe in world history? And I definitely have been starting to, it's hard to pick because you've got so many decades, because you have so many thousands of years of human history. Yes, the Bible does have a lot of history in it. That's true. Some of the books in the Bible are actually written as historical accounts. So, but what was the craziest decade in human history, or the wildest? And it's hard to pick because you would have to go down the line. It would take a long time. But in recent history, maybe in the last century, I'm starting to lean towards the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. This is an era that was crazy, not just in the United States. A lot of people think of the American side of it when you have the Flappers and the Charleston, and you have the speakeasies, women getting the right to vote. You have all of these amazing changes mixed with a very strong economy that tanks at the very end of the decade and the Great Depression starts. But there's actually a lot more to the decade of the 1920s. There's a dark side of the 1920s. There's a religious side to the 1920s. And of course, there's the rest of the world and what's going on there. And I've been watching this really great documentary. Be sure to watch a documentary about history sometime this week. That's talking about going year by year throughout the entire world. And so there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, and it's not just going on in the West. It's not just going on in Europe and the United States. So I want to talk about what made the 1920s the craziest decade in human history. One of the things that definitely does it is obviously the economic boom coming after World War I. It actually the decade starts with two big problems. An influenza pandemic that is called the Spanish flu. And it was called the Spanish flu because Spain was the first country to report on it, not because it came from Spain. Kind of similar to how some people wanted to call COVID the China virus because it came from China. The Spanish flu did not come from Spain. The Spanish flu actually probably originated in the trenches during World War II when or World War I, when men's immunity and physical strength was really, really weak. And because of that, they had all sorts of problems. And they were probably catching cold and tuberculosis and, of course, influenza. And that would lead to the outbreak of a pandemic around the world. Hundreds of thousands of people would die from this pandemic in the United States alone. And the first country to ever report on the actual findings in 1918 was Spain. So, A, the soldiers were dying in the trenches. They thought they were just dying of war. And B, perhaps more importantly, the press was highly censored during World War I, and all of the focus in the newspapers was on the war and what was happening as the war was coming to an end. So a lot of people weren't reporting about the disease. It was the Spanish papers that broke it because Spain was neutral during World War I. So because of that, the Spanish get the name the Spanish flu. So you've got a global pandemic, and you also have an economic recession caused because of the end of the war, the end of wartime production. Countries are all of a sudden in huge debt. So there's a lot of economic downturn in the beginning of the decade. and the United States is actually going to be the one to pull the rest of the world out of that decline and out of that depression when its economy starts to boom in the early 20s under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. And because of that, this actually helps stabilize the European economies, like the French and the British. It definitely helps stabilize the German economy, which is suffering because they have horrible war debt and hyperinflation and a very weak government in the early 1920s, the Weimar Republic. But it also helps stabilize all of the colonies of the British and French Empire in all the areas that they're influential, which is basically everywhere: Africa, India, large parts of Asia. So the economies all start off really poor in a downturn following World War II, but they all end up getting a lot better. World War I again. But they all end up getting a lot better as the U.S. economy rebounds in 1921 and 1922. So you started off the decade with a pandemic and an economic downturn, followed by the beginnings of an economic boom where unemployment hit low rates, tax revenues hit low rates. And this wasn't just happening in the United States. This is happening in Britain, throughout the British Empire. This is happening in France and with the colonies of the French Empire. Meanwhile, you also have in Russia, you have a civil war following the Bolshevik Revolution between the whites and the reds, the whites who were against communism and the reds who are obviously the Red Army, who are the Bolsheviks, the communists. And you have Russia emerging as the first solid Soviet communist state after that in 1921. The Union of the Soviet Republics, the USSR. So you've got communism on the rise in Russia. You have communism becoming popular in Europe at the end of World War I because of a lot of people thinking that they should try communist revolutions. But a lot of the times the governments put down these revolutions and instead kind of go a different way. Then in Italy, you have the rise of fascism with Benito Mussolini. So already this is only 1922. And Russia's communist, the world's gone through a global pandemic, there's an economic downturn and an economic boom starting up, and Italy becomes the first fascist government. So just in the span of the first couple of years of the decade, you already have this craziness going on. Meanwhile, back in the United States, as well as throughout Europe, women have just gotten the right to vote, and a lot of women are dressing in shorter dresses, they're wearing shorter skirts, they're cutting their hair, they're going out and dancing, they're drinking, they're smoking, they're cursing. There's a lot of women's liberation going on throughout the entire world, and that can be seen in the earliest days of the 1920s. So just a few years in, and there's already been huge social upheavals that the pre-war world could not have possibly anticipated. So World War I has changed the entire script. And again, if you like what you're hearing, you like learning about history, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. And be sure to follow me on the social media handles on the tag on the pinned comment, but by my faithful moderator. So also, what else? So you've got that going on. Meanwhile, in India, following World War I, the Indians are sick and tired of dying for the British, and they're sick and tired of being a British colony, so they want to be free, and they think that they have a good chance at being free. And so there's revolts and riots all throughout there. Meanwhile, in China, in 1919, a series of revolutions called the May 4th riots start, where warlords who have kind of divided the country in the wake of the fall of the empire are competing for control and influence over China. And eventually it's going to be the nationalist group that wins out, the nationalists led by Jiang Jin-shi, or as the United States knows him, Chiang Kai-shek. And by the middle of the 20s, he is going to start to take power and consolidate the nationalist control over the country, and he's going to repress his political enemies, especially the communists. And that's going to lead to civil war in China that breaks out by the end of the decade. So China is going to go through a lot of social upheaval. There's going to be a lot of change in China. India is going to want independence. Southern Ireland becomes independent in 1922, and there is fighting in Northern Ireland because the Southern Irish want the Northern Ireland to be free of the British Empire as well. Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. Be sure to like and subscribe. Helps the channel grow. So already, just in the first few years, you've got of the 20s, you've got chaos. You have social upheaval, the change of women's roles. You have women in the United States getting elected to Congress and getting elected as governors and things like that. And the same thing in Britain. And now it seems like the feminist movement isn't just going to end with the suffragettes. It's going to continue and keep going. So, and yes, Ireland. I mentioned Ireland. So Ireland's going to be a free country. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire is going to collapse in 1921 and be replaced by the Republic of Turkey. And the Republic of Turkey is the same country today. So for the last century, Turkey has been a republic, more or less, because of the work of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who kind of stabilized Turkey after the fall of the Ottomans. At the same time, the Middle East is divided up. The British and the French create mandates where they mandate control of the land until they believe the native peoples of that area are able to control themselves and run their own country. And that's where we get the Mandate of Palestine. That's where, and you have mandates in Iran, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, and Syria, and they are going to figure out who gets to rule over those areas. But it's basically them, a semi-colonial state where the British and the French determine a lot of foreign policy, economic policy, and political leadership. So there's calls for reform, there's calls for revolution. The Europeans continue to believe, despite all the blood, all the lives that they caused to lose during World War I, that they are superior to their colonies and that they are civilizing their colonies and that their colonies owe them a debt of gratitude. So they continue to repress their rights. In India, there are riots that the British put down brutally, and the people that put them down brutally, hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. Yes, this is Friendly Neighborhood History, and I am glad you are here. So, what was I going to say? So there's riots in India, there's riots in the Middle East, there's rebellions in Syria because the Syrians do not want to be controlled by the French. The French put them down without mercy. So there's a lot of political repression, there's a lot of societal control, and the British and the French are going to continue to expand their empires. And at this time, the British Empire has pretty much reached the height of its power. This is in addition to controlling Australia, Canada, all sorts of areas. France controls southeastern Asia, called Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They also control huge amounts of West Africa. Let's see. What is the topic today? Have you heard of Nanzio Island in Russia? No, I have not heard of that island. Hello, welcome. The topic, I've been talking about the Roaring '20s and how it's the craziest decade in all of human history. But again, as always, if you have a topic you'd like to ask about, if you have something you want to bring up, be sure to drop it in the chat and I will get to it very, very soon. That's what this is. It isn't just me rambling. It's a Q&A. It's an Ask Me Anything. You guys bring up the social studies and I bring up the answers as best as I can. So at the same time, going back to the Soviet Union, Lenin dies in 1924, and the replacement for him is not Trotsky, like a lot of people thought. It ends up being Stalin, who nobody thought would be his successor, but has influenced the party hierarchy so much so that he basically controls registration and party positions. And by the late 20s, he has not only taken over, but he has ended the semi-open markets that Lenin had created. Basically, during the Civil War, Russia became extraordinarily economically weak, as it already was in many ways, and that led to forced collectivization of food for the Red Army had led to starvation and 5 million people dying. And future American President Herbert Hoover had actually organized food drives to help the Russians not starve to death in greater numbers, and so that had led to all sorts of starvation and problems. Lenin, seeing that that socialism wasn't working and that the war had destroyed the country in the Civil War and World War I, basically decides to put communism in retreat, as he calls it, and opens up the markets a little bit. This doesn't last forever. Stalin's going to continue until the late 20s. Then he's going to start collectivization of the farms in peacetime. He's going to force people to move to the cities, basically, and he's going to start massive and rapid industrialization and urbanization to get Russia to the communist paradise that it needs to be. And so that's what he's going to be doing in the late 20s. So the Soviet Union is going through a lot of changes as communism solidifies itself. It becomes a new country. It sees somewhat openness economically, and then eventually Stalin's repression really starts to dig into the people of Russia in the late 20s. So, yeah. Teach you hidden history, yes, I love to learn hidden history, because the more hidden history I learn, the less hidden history there is. Yeah, the style, and by the way, and so Seth brings up a great point. So we've been talking about a lot of the politics and the economics, but the style and the fashion are incredible. So I mentioned already, women are wearing shorter dresses, they're cutting their hair short, a lot of them are wearing bonnets and hats. Coco Chanel in France becomes the most decorated and well-known designer in the entire world. She's extraordinarily popular, and all of the French bon vivants, the people who love the finer things, flock to Paris. They flock there. The writers are living there. People like William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein. Uh, T.S. Eliot is writing poems. F. Scott Fitzgerald is recording the events of a rise of the newest music, jazz. So there's new art, there's new literature that's kind of reflecting on the depression and the loss and the sadness of World War I and looking to the opulence of the 1920s and seeing that that's ephemeral and that humanity continues to struggle with problems that it struggled with before, during, and after the war. So you have a revolution in fashion, you have a revolution in design and style, the way women are dressing, what they're dancing, what they're allowed to do. And these revolutions and these changes in style and music and fashion really tend to affect women more than they even affect men. But men's fashion is very popular at this time. So Coco Chanel is the best designer in the world. Everyone wants to go to Paris and live with and be around Gertrude Stein and the lost generation of writers. People are in the United States, people are flocking to Harlem to go listen to African Americans playing jazz music. And these are white people who, despite the racial segregation, are starting to mix culturally with African Americans because of their love of jazz. And one of the biggest jazz dances comes out of Charleston in the early 20s, and it's obviously the Charleston. This is also the age of rising celebrities. You have the rise of people like Charles Lindbergh as one of the biggest celebrities in the world when he is able to fly across the Atlantic. I mean, now planes fly all around the world, but back then, this is obviously only 20 years after the Wright brothers made the first real successful plane. Charles Lindbergh is flying in the Spirit of St. Louis in 1926 from, I think it's New York to Paris. And that makes him the biggest celebrity in the world. People are also going to films. There's no talkies yet until the really late 20s, but people are watching silent films. They're listening to live music playing over as kind of a running soundtrack over these movies with these subtitles and these characters. And there's big stars like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, and of course Rudolph Valentino, who is this handsome Italian heartthrob who passes away only at 31, a devastating loss for Hollywood in 1926. So New York is on the rise of jazz. Paris is on the rise for writers and poets and for art. And Hollywood is on the rise for music and all sorts of, not music, for film. So Tinseltown is coming into its own during the 1920s as millions and millions more people go to see movies. Millions and millions of more people are also listening to music and the jazz that they love so much on radios. As by the middle of the decade, there are thousands of radio stations all over the world, when at the beginning of the decade, there were hardly any. So there's technological transformations that make things a lot easier. Washing machines become popular, and while you're washing your clothes and your linens, you can get in your new Model T, the Tin Lizzie, and drive around. Church attendance dips because people are actually driving around and going to different places. So there's a lot of amazing stuff going on in the 20s. Technologically, artistically, fashion-wise, music-wise, there's all sorts of amazing changes. Let's see. I've got some people bringing up stuff. Hello, welcome. Yeah, the effect of World War I is massive. A lot of people look at World War I and all the loss and devastation, and they say, "Oh, it was so horrible. How could this war have happened?" It was, as it's called, the war to end all wars. And basically for what? Because the Europeans all wanted to fight each other? Well, yes, it was kind of that way, and it was terrible. But things changed so much. The world is unrecognizable afterwards. And the 20s is an unrecognizable decade from the pre-war years of the early 1910s. That's really interesting. You live in Vladivostok, so you're on the other end of the world. Wow, that's amazing. I love it when I hear people coming from other parts of the world and tuning in. It's really, really awesome. Yes, Serbia suffers in World War I. Serbia is basically the epicenter of where World War I starts, and it's all because of this small country, Serbia, that the Russian Empire, which is the largest in the world, the Austro-Hungarians, which has the most diverse in the world, the German Empire, which is the most productive in the world, the British, which has the most colonies, and the French Empire, which is the only republic, all go to war because of this small country, Serbia, and the Austro-Hungarians wanting to bully it. Interesting. So there's a lot of amazing stuff going on. And this isn't only the first half of the decade. You're seeing these revolutions in consumer products. It's not just that you have washing machines and cars and radios, you have affordable washing machines, cars, and radios. And obviously, Ford's assembly line changes the whole game because you can put together a car a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, wages go up, value goes up, but prices of cars go down. And all of a sudden, people have the opportunity to go for Sunday drives because that's what they do. They can afford it and they can afford their cars. So the entire world has changed. Everything has changed, and things you would have never seen in 1913 before the war, you're seeing constantly. Women smoking, women dancing in clubs, silent films. Although they were becoming common in the 1910s, they really take a leap as more millions of people are flocking to cinemas in London and Paris and in Berlin. And although Germany starts off the decade rough, by the middle of the decade, mainly because of the United States bailing them out, their currency starts to stabilize. They have good governmental leaders like Gustav Stresemann, and the radical parties on both the left and the right, the Marxists, called the Spartakists, and the Nazis, have become almost non-existent because the German government has stabilized. Obviously, the tailspin that's going to change everything at the end of the decade is the Great Depression. But even before that, there's already changes happening. Like I said, church attendance is dipping, so there's religious changes. The Scopes Monkey trial happens in 1925, and this changes the way people are going to look at religion because you all of a sudden have this whole issue of laws against evolution, and evolution is becoming more and more accepted science at the time. And it should be taught if it's accepted science, right? That's the common understanding and idea of that generation. So if you're just joining us, we are talking about the 1920s and what a wild decade it was. But this is our weekly Q&A for the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Actually, we'll have a part 2 tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and the pinned, tagged comment that you can see will also direct you to the social media channels. So, yeah. 20% French, Huguenot, 20. Thanks. Okay, so hold on. So sorry about that. A couple of noises and distractions going on, but anyways, yeah. So the opulence and the enjoyment seems to be never ending until the depression hits, and that's going to change everything, and everything's going to kind of go to hell in a handbasket because of that. But you have religious foundations being challenged. You have creationism being challenged. You have this debate between creationism and evolutionism, and can we just teach evolution coming to the foreway in the Scopes Monkey trial, where a former presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, is standing up for the side of creationism against Clarence Darrow, the most famous lawyer of all time, at least in that era, who is fighting for the right to free speech and the ability for evolution. And if you like that story, it actually has been turned into a very famous play and movie, Inherit the Wind. Yeah. So there's a lot going on. Yep, good mouth reading. So, what was I going to say? Interesting. So, anyways, the opulence, the wealth, the prosperity that is affecting the U.S., affecting the West, affecting Europe, and affecting Europe's colonies seems interminable, but it's not going to be interminable. The United States continual isolationism is only going to make it more and more detached from Europe, and when the Depression hits, it's going to make it extremely detached from Europe, and it's going to make it unable to really get involved when Europe starts to radicalize itself, especially the Germans and the Italians. Meanwhile, Japan has become angry during the 1920s because although they fought in World War I, they did not receive the privileges and the rewards that they thought they would have. And they feel continually isolated by the British and the French. And so they are going to elect a more conservative party, a more nationalistic party in Japan in the mid-20s that's going to push them towards militarism And by the end of the decade, they already have their sights back on China. They've already had a war with China that's gone very well for them, and they're looking to attack China again. China is weak because of their own civil war that breaks out in 1927 between the communists and the nationalists, Jiang Jieshi, and eventually, of course, the communists will be led by Mao Zedong. By the end of the decade, everything starts to change again because of the collapse of the US stock market. And it's not immediately apparent that the economies of the world are all going to collapse, but by 1930, 1931, things are really looking down for Europe. And if they look down for Europe, they're going to look really bad for Germany, which is in so much debt and relying on the value of the US dollar to sustain them. So when the American dollar collapses, the German economy tanks even harder than the American economy, which leads to the demand for radical change, and radical change is obviously offered by the Nazis. So that is just some history about the craziest decade. There was a bunch that I didn't even get to that was really, really incredible, that there was never, no one expected the decade to quite turn out that way, and I think it's an absolutely crazy decade. And a lot of people, I remember at the beginning of 2020, were saying we were entering yet another roaring 20s. And interestingly enough, the roaring 20s started with a global pandemic and an economic downturn, and so did this decade. So who knows what this will look like. Let's see. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Inflation in Germany. Yeah, the depression is coming. The U.S. is just waiting to drop it on a war and the people. Okay. Inflation in Germany. Yeah, basically, at the end of World War I, the Allies forced the Germans, the Weimar Republic, which has replaced the Kaiser, the emperor, to basically pay huge amounts of war debt. And the German government, in order to do this, decides the best thing that they can do is get rid of the debt as soon as possible. So they actually create huge, huge industries of just printing money. And by printing the money, they devalue their currency. And they devalue it more than anyone else in history. And there are some historians who think that they are doing this not so that they can pay back their debt, but so that they can have an international crisis that will get the Europeans and Americans off their back about their debt. Who knows if that's true or not? But of course, this is people who are paying 1 billion marks, the German unit of currency, for a loaf of bread. These are people running out, getting their pay at 9 o'clock and running out as fast as they can from their workplace to go buy coffee and bread and sugar, because by 10 o'clock, the prices will have doubled. The inflation is so utterly catastrophic that it almost levels and destroys their economy. And it's the United States that steps in. Businessman Charles Dawes, who later becomes vice president, basically says the United States will loan out money to the Germans, and that will stabilize their currency, and then they can pay them back. What this obviously means is that the U.S. is just going to get richer and richer, because the Allies, Britain and France, have borrowed a bunch of money to pay for their war from the United States. So the United States is getting huge amounts of money from Britain and France in the early part of the decades, and now they're going to have Germany paying them back. So the United States has everybody giving them money because they gave out money and ammunition and supplies during World War I. In fact, when they were sending their ships over to the British to give them these supplies, German U-boats, submarines, were sinking them, and that's what helped bring the United States into World War I. So the United States is actually going to bail Germany out economically in the 20s, but when the American economy tanks, so much of the debt of the Germans is owned by the U.S., the German economy also tanks. So how did Joseph Stalin start collecting countries around the Soviet Union? You mean collectivization, or you mean like collecting? Because he basically, in the early 40s, while Hitler is doing his nonsense in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, Stalin invades Finland. He almost defeats them. He also takes over the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, who accepted the Soviets. But obviously, the Soviet Union is huge. It consolidates a lot of power and control. And it's not just Russia. It's also exerting control over Ukraine and Belarus, these modern nation states. It tries to take over Poland. It fails. There's actually a war in Poland in 1919 where the Polish surprisingly are able to hold off the Russians and stop Bolshevism from spreading to Europe at a very, very sensitive time for Europe, when Lenin believed that communism was ready to take over the entire globe. Joseph Pilsudski is the head of the Polish state, and he's able to stand up to them, and by the late 20s, he has made himself the military dictator of Poland. Uh, Admiral Leihaus in Hungary, which is broken off from Austria at the end of World War I. He creates a dictatorship. So there's several, you almost want to say militaristic or right-wing dictatorships in Central and Eastern Europe during the 1920s that I forgot to even mention. But basically, Stalin's collectivization, he's got a sphere of influence. So the Soviet Union controls Ukraine, it controls Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, it takes over the Transcaucasus regions in the early 20s, Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then it goes into what is Kazakhstan and areas like that. A lot of the Stan countries in Central Eurasia, basically. And Stalin basically forces collectivization by either seizing land or seizing people, or both. And basically, if you do not comply, you will be wiped out in some way, shape, or form. And he targets a middle class a group of peasants called the kulaks, who do not want to go onto collective farms, do not want to share their produce with everyone else, who would rather sell it and make their own yields, and they think that system is better. And basically, Stalin defines the kulaks as anyone who owns a horse. And so he targets them, he confiscates their land, he confiscates their food, and because of this, many of them are tortured, killed, or sent to work camps called gulags. And at the same time, the food yields decrease, which leads to famine. And so there's a second famine in the Soviet Union in the early 30s, particularly in the Ukraine, and there are millions of people dying once again because of collectivization. So, so that's some things about that, and I'm so glad Omni-Man has joined the chat. That always makes me feel good. And of course, if I wanted to make a meme, I could say, Stalin, when do we create the perfect communist state? That's the neat part. We don't. Anyways, that was bad. Yeah, the Nazis weren't necessarily saying it was all going to happen. They were just they were hoping it would happen so they could capitalize on a crisis. That was what the Nazis and the fascists and the communists did. They capitalized. That's what all totalitarian, authoritarian, fascist systems do. They capitalize on crisis. Yes, there is the famous picture. People would literally have wheelbarrows full of cash, but it would have no value. So they would take it in and be able to buy maybe bread, maybe tea if they were lucky, but who knows if it would be enough or not. What do you mean the Europeans should have seen what the Americans were doing? Yeah, the Winter War was a surprising defeat for the Soviets. They thought that they could body Poland, and they couldn't. No, I think that Kaliningrad, it could go back to Germany. It's obviously this very disputed territory because it's part of Poland. It was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is a very underrated, basically mini empire in Eastern Europe during the 15th and 16th and 17th century that was really powerful. But then it's part of Brandenburg Prussia. Then it's part of Russia. I don't know if it should go back to them or not. Stalin hated the Poles. Yes, he definitely did. And actually, he made an agreement with Hitler called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which split up Poland. The Soviets take the eastern half, and the Germans take the western half. And a lot of people don't know that. And it was actually from there that Hitler invades the Soviet Union. He's invading eastern Poland in 1941. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. That's totally not creepy at all. No, yeah, the Winter War was between Finland and USSR. I might have misspoken. But Poland gets invaded and divvied up by the Russians and the Germans in 1939. A lot of people focus on only the Russian part of it, but they don't focus on in the German part, they don't focus on what the Soviets did in Poland. So there's just a little bit of background about the most interesting and probably crazy decade of all time, because you have the rise of radical political ideology, you have Christian fundamentalism, you all interacting with jazz, big band music, and of course you have prohibition and speakeasies, which I barely got to talk about, but basically the United States outlawing alcohol really goes wild. You have people making their own types of drinks in their own homes. You have a rise of organized crime and the mafia in big cities who are peddling alcohol and running it from Canada into the United States. The Caesar salad is actually invented by Cesar Cardini, who has made a restaurant in Tijuana because he knows the Americans will go there to drink. And he actually one night on a 4th of July party runs out of food, so he throws together everything his waiters can find, and that's where we get the Caesar salad. Yeah, who doesn't love a good speakeasy? Am I right? And I do too. I've known quite a few, and basically, there's one that I like to go to where you turn the dial and you call in and you go inside, and they've got the door. I've been to some with the fake wall. It's really really cool, and that's all replicas of what they were doing in the 1920s with speakeasies. They were basically they were these places that could turn on a dime and they could pretend to be a regular restaurant or nightclub with music or something like that, or they could pretend to be a coffee shop, but they would turn everything around and all of a sudden there would be booze. And there would be all sorts of things, and they had switches and levers and all sorts of ways that they could keep the feds from finding out. They had a passcode that you had to enter. They had a system. A lot of them were organized by the mafia and other crime syndicates in the big municipalities. And alcohol consumption did not decline. People were making alcohol at home, moonshine, bathtub gin, stuff like that. And a lot of them were dying because they were oversaturating the alcohol. It also led to the creation of cocktails. Cocktails are actually an invention of the 1920s and the Prohibition era, because all of a sudden, to water down this very strong, powerful alcohol, people would decide to start mixing it with different flavors. Because back in the 19th century, people just kind of drank it straight up. Whiskey, you had women, gin becomes a very popular English alcohol that women like to sip. That's the Victorian model. But with things as strong as bathtub gin and moonshine, you need something to taper that down. And so all of a sudden, people are making mixers and chasers and all sorts of mitigators, and that's where you get the rise of cocktails. Obviously, one of the most famous alcohol mixologists of the era is a man named Martini. And we get the name of the martini glass, and anything served in a martini glass is technically a martini, even if it's not a martini, the drink. Yeah, so moving right along though. So if you like speakeasies, if you like cocktails, you can thank the 1920s, this crazy decade where you've got the Nazis and the communists in Europe, and yet you've also got speakeasies here. It's quite crazy in the United States. Yeah, and if it's illegal, it makes it more fun. And by 1933, obviously, the Americans are kind of over it and they get rid of it. Franklin Roosevelt wins partly because he promises to get rid of Prohibition. But obviously, the 20s, and the irony is that the decade is not known for. The decade was when alcohol was illegal, the sale of alcohol. Although you could get alcohol for medicinal purposes, interestingly enough. So there were medicinal ways that you could get alcohol that were. My video's freezing. There were medicinal ways that you could get alcohol, and you could give any reason basically you wanted for why you would have alcohol, and they would give it to you. And they actually kept it in safes, and they kept it away from the people, and they had medicinal purposes, just like they do for marijuana. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit there. But obviously, the most famous and common way to get alcohol in that era was to go to the speakeasies, and these places would just kind of pretend to be nightclubs, pretend to be restaurants, but there was other parts of them that would have a bar. And obviously, they kind of coincide with the jazz age, with people listening to jazz music, with new dances, with Harlem, with this mixing of culture between African Americans and white Americans. So they're all kind of interwoven together. Let's see here. So I just watched a weird video on Watch Mojo, top 10 genocide. Yeah, why would Watch Mojo do a top 10? I like Watch Mojo, but top 10 genocides throughout history. Why would you even call it that? Wouldn't it be the worst genocides in history? Armenia is only 7. Well, the thing about the Armenian genocide is a lot of people don't know about it. And interestingly enough, it is one of the few genocides in history that the oppressor, the side that committed the genocide, will not own up to it. To this day, the Turks deny that it happened, but the displacement, like we were talking about with the Trail of Tears earlier, the dispossession of land, the forced migration of the Armenians led to about 1 million to 1.5 million Armenians dying in World War I at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. And that is considered, in many ways, the first genocide of the 20th century, a century that is not bereft of genocides. Why did Prohibition happen in the first place? There was a movement in the United States called the Temperance Movement that was born in the 19th century out of the Second Great Awakening, in which a lot of Americans wanted to stop, believe that God was calling them to get rid of the sale of alcohol. It was very popular among suffragettes, women who were fighting for the right to vote, to protest not just for their right to vote, but also against slavery before the Civil War, and then also against selling alcohol, because they believed that it was leading to the moral decay of the nation. And they were very concerned, and they worked very hard to produce a temperance movement. There was even a prohibition political party in the United States, a third party throughout the last decades of the 19th century that was trying to take care of this. And they got kind of far politically. Not as much, obviously, as the Republicans and the Democrats, but they were a significant third party, similar to how the Green and Libertarian parties are significant parties today. So there was this whole movement, and it gains enough steam, and enough states are passing prohibition and temperance laws at the same time they're giving women the right to vote, that eventually you get the 18th Amendment in 1919, followed shortly by the 19th a year later, which grants women the right to vote. Americans are generally tend, if you compare them to the rest of the world, at least the rest of the European world, or the Western world, generally tend to be more conservative and more religious. Overwhelmingly, substantially so. The center-right parties in Canada and Great Britain and Germany and France, not Germany anymore, tend to be more pretty much in the middle of the left in the United States. The political spectrum is different. The religious life is different, all of that. So anyway, so there's a little bit about that crazy generation that we call the Roaring 20s, because the economy roared and because the culture roared, the society roared. A lot of things were roaring in the 1920s, and it all came crashing down with the collapse of the stock market and the fall of the economic prosperity that had buoyed all of these cultural changes. Britain is much different, and I'm glad to hear that I've got somebody coming in from England, or Britain, I should say. It's always fun to have someone. We've got people who come in from Finland, from Greece, from Turkey, from all sorts of places. Some guy came on from India, and it was like a 13-hour, 12-hour difference from when the stream started, and he was saying he couldn't sleep, and after a few minutes, I'm sure I put him to sleep. So that was always good. So that's good to know. But yeah, that's some things about the Roaring 20s. We've got another about 15 minutes in our time here. I'd like to draw our attention to another topic that concerns Americans a little bit more, and that is only because there is an interesting birthday coming up just in the next week that I will be covering on the channel. You are oh, that's really interesting. You're a dual citizen of Russia and England. Really cool. So I talked about this on the channel, and next time I'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully, if you guys come. Again, if you enjoy what you're hearing, if you enjoy learning about history, like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, makes a big difference, all of that fun stuff. But I'll be talking about this a little bit tomorrow as well, but next weekend, it will have already passed, so I want to bring it up now, on, I believe it's Tuesday, October 1st, President Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter of the United States, will be 100 years old. He has been on hospice care for quite some time now, and his wife passed away last year after the two of them were married for 75 years. And I believe she was 95 or so. So they've been married for an extremely long time. Carter has already surpassed several other American presidents as the longest living president in American history. And Carter has quite an impressive resume and legacy under him, and to become the first American president to live for a century would be quite an amazing accomplishment for the United States. So that's something that is going on there. I'm going to talk about his legacy and reputation and what he has done and his accomplishments in a video that will drop, obviously, on his birthday as my birthday present to him. I'll talk a little bit about him in a second. My mom is Russian, my dad British. No, my mom isn't. I didn't think that about you, but that is very interesting. And you're living in Vladivostok. So, I mean, that's the eastern edge of a huge expanse of land that is Russia. So that's really fascinating. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that with us. Anyway, so Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer from Georgia who served in World War II, married Rosalind, and was married, like I said, for 75 years, had several sons and daughters with her. and was known for being very religious, speaking of Americans and religion, kind of a Baptist, Southern Baptist guy. He taught Sunday school. And despite the fact that he was living in the Deep South in the 40s and the 50s, he opposed segregation. He believed that the races needed to be integrated, and he believed in the equality of all people, which made him stand out compared to many other people in the South at the time, and he was willing to risk it. Being a Democrat in the South opposed to segregation was extremely uncommon in the 1950s and 60s, and yet Carter stood against it. He eventually became an assemblyman and the governor of Georgia in the 1970s. Interesting. Near Korea. I love Manchurian history. Yeah, Manchurian history. And that's exactly, by the way, free Manchuria. That's exactly where World War II for some people starts in 1931 when Japan attacks Manchuria at the Mudek Bridge incident, which leads to, obviously, their prolonged investment in China with the Second Sino-Japanese War starting in 1937. And, of course, they will be involved in fighting against the British and the Americans in the Pacific and in India and areas like that for the next several years after that. So a lot of people think World War II starts as early as 1931 when the Japanese invade Manchuria at Mudek. But anyways, that aside, back to what we were just talking about with Jimmy Carter. So Carter becomes the governor of Georgia in the 1970s, and he gains a reputation for being very mild-mannered, very free of corruption, very likable, kind of an all-shucks personality, a reasonable guy for the most part. And him standing up for racial equality obviously wins him a lot of points with the American people because it proves that he's willing to stand up for it even in an area where that is not very popular. And he is seen as a different change. So he emerges kind of as a dark horse, somebody who they weren't expecting to pick to be the presidential nominee for the Democrats in 1976. And he's going up against Gerald Ford, who was Richard Nixon's vice president. Ford, by the way, was the longest living president. He lived to be about 94 until Carter surpassed him some years ago. Ford was Nixon's vice president as the only president to never be elected vice president or president, as Nixon's original vice president was stepped down due to tax evasion, and his current and then he selects Gerald Ford, who is a congressman, to be his vice president, and then Nixon steps down because of Watergate, and Ford is all of a sudden president in just the space of a year. And so Ford becomes president, and he is seen as the continuation of Nixon's corruption, not because he himself is corrupt or he has ties to Agnew's tax evasion or to Watergate, but because he pardons Nixon. He basically says that he's going to let Nixon go without criminal charges because he believes that it will tear the United States apart if he does that, and he doesn't want to do that. So that leads to him becoming very unpopular, although a lot of people today consider Ford did the right thing, not wanting to tear the country apart by watching a president on trial. Although that was seen in retrospect as a wise and skillful decision, although Ford had some other good accomplishments, with the economy stagnating, with the Soviet Union still an existential threat, although kind of a little bit more peaceable in the 1970s due to this peace movement called détente. Ford is not the most popular person in the world. The devastating evacuation of Saigon, marking the end of America's chapter in Vietnam, which humiliated the United States in many ways, happens when Ford is president. You have the Soviets, you have him pardoning Nixon, you have a lot of things that are really hurting Ford's reputation, and so he's kind of an easy target. He actually has to run against Ronald Reagan in the Republican primary in 1976 and just barely squeaks out at the convention. So with that going on, he runs against this dark horse, this likable guy, and Carter is seen as a Washington outsider, and that is exactly how the Democrats want to run him, because they want someone who is not on the inside working in the political higher echelons who could be seen as corrupt. Carter doesn't seem corrupt. He seems honest, he seems straightforward, and he seems likable. And it's a close election. It's not an overwhelming win for Carter because he's not very well known. He has to get his name out there, but he ends up winning. And this guy who is just a simple Georgia peanut farmer and Sunday school teacher who is known for his strong Baptistic faith and for his belief in fairness and equality and being a Washington outsider is all of a sudden president of the United States. So we went from rural Georgia, I think it was Plains, Georgia, to being the president of the United States. And Carter has a lot of problems to deal with during his presidency. And he basically has this vision that he can continue the government programs of Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson from a decade prior and continue to promote them and make America stronger and better through them. And the programs take a while to get off the ground. Carter is hit obviously with the economy, and he's not seemingly able to do much to stop it. He tends to take on more responsibility that he needs. He doesn't really have a chief of staff. He serves as his own chief of staff, and because he's unable to delegate authority, he kind of gets in over his head pretty quickly. However, he continues to fight for peace. His biggest accomplishment probably is the peace between Begin and Anwar Sadat, the Israeli prime minister and the president of Egypt in 1978. This agreement ends the continual fighting between Sadat and the Egyptians against the Israelis, and it becomes the first time a Muslim country recognizes Israel's right to exist. It's a huge historical moment. Carter doesn't get enough credit for it, and Carter made that happen in 1978. He also, so that's a big accomplishment for him. If I am correct, he creates both the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. However, foreign policy continues to be a struggle, especially in 1979. In 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, trying to stabilize a communist government there. And Carter obviously is watching this, and there's this idea of continual détente, of not wanting to draw lines with the Soviets. Carter pulls the U.S. out of the Moscow Olympics in 1980 and allows the Soviets basically to win all the golds. But this is how they and many other Western countries protest the Soviets' aggression in Afghanistan. At the same time, the biggest foreign policy issue of Carter's presidency is the fall of Iran. The Shah of Iran, who has become an unpopular dictator and very repressive, is overthrown in a revolution that combined radical Islamic fundamentalists who believe that Iran was too liberal with communists who believe, and leftists and students who believe that Iran wasn't free and liberal enough. And basically, they got kind of duped and used by radical mullahs and radical extreme Muslims at the top, led by Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini. And with the Shah overthrown, he flees to the United States and dies of cancer soon afterwards. And with many of the upper class in Iran fleeing, there's absolute chaos because the United States had supported the Shah and supported the Iranian government for a long time. There are a lot of Americans in Iran, and they are taken hostage in 1979. This becomes humiliating for Carter because the hostages stay for over a year. So Carter is in kind of big trouble. Come in 1980. And the problem he has is there's also, of course, the energy crisis. There's continual gas shortages. The economy is not doing well. Inflation, there is stagflation where the wages are stagnant, but inflation is up. Unemployment is high. He's dealing with the worst recession since the Great Depression. He's not necessarily the cause of all of these things, but for a lot of people in 1980, he is not the solution. And the problem is he runs against Ronald Reagan, who is charismatic, charming, and is very much, although Carter is a very nice guy and trying to do the right things, Reagan promises solutions, and he is far more charismatic than Carter. And Carter loses his reelection bid to Reagan in a big, big landslide. And it's a sad thing. This was obviously a man with the best of intentions who had a lot of wise ideas and a lot of smart things and is not given credit for several things. For instance, after he was defeated by Reagan, he worked tirelessly to the end of his presidency to make sure the hostages were released, and they were indeed released at the end, right the day before he left office. Reagan got the credit because he's coming into office and he's seen as the one who made the change, but Carter was the one who did all the hard work. So you think that would be the end of Carter's story, that he would just write or do stuff like that, but Carter continued for decades to work tirelessly for Habitat for Humanity and other organizations to provide relief, building housing for the poor, providing food and relief to those suffering, providing medical attention to those dealing with all sorts of epidemics. And Carter's reputation as a humanitarian is perhaps more impeccable than his reputation as a politician and president. And it was for this work, not his presidency, that he won his Nobel Prize in 2002. He is one of only 4 American presidents to win the Nobel Prize. Is it 4? Him, Barack Obama, who won it when he was president, Teddy Roosevelt, and I think Herbert Hoover, if I am correct. And Al Gore is the only U.S. vice president, by the way, who has won a Nobel Prize for his work in the environmental world. So Carter continues to be an outspoken advocate for civil rights and for humanitarian rights, and worked tirelessly in those efforts well into his 80s, building homes and trying to help people who needed it. And that has been what has buoyed his legacy despite his difficulties as president. And so he has an amazing story. Born in that crazy 20s decade in the South when the world was so different, he has seen an entire century go by, and he got to be a huge part of that century, being a governor, being a president, being a figure in politics, in many ways, and being very popular and loved and respected by his political friends and political foes alike. And many people, even critics of him, I've seen it in the chat mentioned, said that he was a poor president, or he didn't do a great job, or he really messed up a lot. Some people have considered him the worst president ever. I don't think that's fair at all. Have to acknowledge his good work for humanity as a whole. So just a quick story there about the life and legacy of the 39th president, Jimmy Carter, who really has done a lot to make the world a better place and is about to pass the century mark in just a few days. So I will be releasing a full-length video about that, as well as some shorts talking about him. My Born Today video will be all about him that day. If you like this content, if you like what I'm talking about, as it's been suggested by my wonderful moderator in the chat, like and subscribe, and follow me on the social media handles, because it would be great to connect with you there as well. So let's see. I'm going to go through the chats for a few questions, and then we will wrap it up. Nixon was a great president. He was only one-termer. Yeah, I think that there's been some one-term presidents that have been really great. James Polk, William McKinley was 2 terms, but he was assassinated early in his second. There have been some presidents who did a good job in just 1 term. Carter has kind of struggled to be one of them. Nixon was a great president. He was stitched up. Yeah, I've heard people say that Nixon did what they all did. He just got caught at it. I don't like to think that's true. I think Nixon obviously had some real big wins in his first term especially, but I think his own paranoia mixed with a distrust of the media, a distrust of everyone around him, basically led him into Watergate, and him lying about it only made it worse, and it sullied a reputation of who had been a very accomplished and successful statesman up to that point. So I agree with you there. Thank you. I appreciate that. I am bloody hell. I am knowledgeable. I'll take that as my big compliment for the day. You shouldn't mix politics and sport. I don't know what you mean quite with that, but Carter definitely had his struggles politically. Yeah, Reagan basically just has this very different approach from Carter, very different approach from most presidents. And I think a lot of people really dislike Ronald Reagan. And I understand why they really dislike Ronald Reagan. He is polarizing, especially nowadays, as people look back on 40 years ago. But the thing they don't understand, or they may not understand, even people who like him may not understand this, is that Reagan was very different as a president. He changed American foreign policy. He revitalized the conservative movement in a way that it had not been. For years before that, the Republicans were kind of a moderate center-right party. Reagan shoved the party to the right. And he is continually on the right. Any right-wing figure in this country for the next century will probably be compared to Ronald Reagan. So the way he changed the economic and the political and the foreign policy game, he can't be underestimated. His impact on American history is monumental. Thatcher and Reagan were a dream team. Yeah, Thatcher. There's a very interesting historical phenomenon that goes on in the 80s, because you have Reagan and Thatcher, you have Stephen Harper in Canada, you have Helmut Kohl, you have the Pope, John Paul II. It's like the entire world all lines up to stand up to communism and the Soviet Union at this time. The French, I think it was Mitterrand, who was a semi-conservative president. So you have the right triumphing in the 80s, basically the last gasp of that greatest generation standing up to the Soviets, and Reagan not mincing words to do so, Thatcher not mincing words to do so. The Pope, who is from Poland, who has lived under communism for decades, goes back to Poland knowing that it's a communist state and condemns communism. And so you have these figures all throughout the world that are implementing right-wing economic policies, but are also really trying to take it to the Soviets. And Reagan had theorized for years that basically, if the United States just spent a lot of money on the military and saw an economic boom, the Soviets could not keep up. And I think that he was right. So, yeah, but anyways, that was a very strong, powerful team. And a lot of people on the conservative side wonder if that's ever going to happen again. So, how are different? So I really appreciate all the compliments and support. You guys are really the best ever. How different are the Republicans now versus late 1800s? It's interesting because there's several different eras and times when the parties in America are considered to have changed, where the Republicans and the Democrats are considered to have changed, and a lot of people think that's going on right now with Donald Trump changing the framework of the Republican Party. The late 1800s, there were a lot of Republicans who believed in the progressive movement, who believed that it was best for the government to be more involved in helping people and getting things fixed. That's obviously different in many ways than the Republicans today. However, there were a lot of Republicans who believed in strong capitalistic themes during the early 1900s and late 1800s. William McKinley is a great example of that. And these guys kind of have been a common thread of the Republican Party despite the fact that they kind of believed in protectionism throughout its history. So the Republican affinity for capitalism and affinity for wealthy business interests, it's been there for a long time. So it's different in plenty of ways, as any entity would be different in a century. You can't have a century without an entity changing, but it's not exactly the same. So, yes, for every share a historian gets their wings. Yes, so if you guys, thank you so much to my wonderful moderator, and to all of you. We are going to wrap it up there. I hope you all have a great and wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern, for part 2 of our weekly weekend Q&A on the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Take care and have a great day, everybody. Thanks for coming.